Well, last seminar, we looked at diatoms and chalk. We saw that whale buried in diatoms that was standing on end, so it had to be a catastrophe to stack all those diatoms up in a short period of time. We also looked at amalgamations, and I had a sister tell me that she believed that there was something Ellen White wrote about amalgamations after the flood. So if some of you have a reference for that, I'd love to see it. So I'm still looking at that. Also, there was a number of dinosaur legends. We also had, we looked at Job that had Behemoth and Leviathan that God said he made. So we also looked at snakes and reptiles and how they grow and grow and grow their entire life so they can get very large, like the large reptiles, dinosaurs. We looked at some photos of dinosaurs that have washed up on beaches, and we saw an actual stuffed plesiosaur. All these things are difficulties for evolution because they believe they were 68 million years ago or more. So you've seen the old fairy tale. If you kiss a frog, what are you going to get? Well, maybe you got to get the right frog. Uh-oh. Well, what they say is, if a frog turns into a handsome prince quickly, it's a fairy tale. But if a frog turns into a handsome prince slowly, it's called modern science. So, Grandpa, is your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandpa a frog? Here is a Discover magazine from 2004. It says, was your ancestor a sea sponge? This is your ancestor. Who's your daddy? Was your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather SpongeBob? Well, there's a variety of alligators. You have freshwater alligators and saltwater alligators. But I think probably the ancestor for these alligators was probably an alligator. You know, in evolution, they talk about, you know, you have to have raining on the rocks forever, and then you can get life. So, you know, maybe our ancestor is a rock. So can you go from Flint to Quint? Or from Chert to Chihuahuas? Maybe Mica to Mocha? Bauxite to buzzsaw? I found a verse in the Bible. It said, saying to this stock, or maybe a sponge, thou art my father. And to a stone, maybe flint, chert, mica, bauxite, thou hast brought me forth. For they have turned their back unto me, and not their face. But in the time of trouble they will say, arise and save us. And God goes on to say, well, let your stones or your stocks save you. We have somebody better to call on. Now I want to look a little bit at the whole business of evolution. Now they have actually two different ways of talking about evolution, and they kind of mix them up. They kind of do a sleight of hand. You know, they talk about microevolution, and then they kind of slip over macroevolution and say, oh, well, that's what's true. So let's look a little bit microevolution. It's sort of after their kind. I actually don't like the word microevolution. I'd rather say variation. Because we have variations of creatures. You know, a dog has different kinds of dogs as you breed them, for instance. Or roses have different kinds of roses. But probably the ancestor of a rose was probably a rose. Now, that's variation. It's observed. It's scientific. And it's scriptural. But macroevolution, it's assumed. You know, they say, well, we're here. And like that's proof that, well, we had to come from somewhere else. You know, that we had to be something before. And it's religious in the sense it takes a leap of faith, I would say a wild leap of faith, and also a leap in logic. It's actually unscriptural, and it's really based on fantasy and imagination. You know, our mind is very powerful. We can imagine things morphing from one thing into another, but that doesn't mean it did. So where's the theory come from? It's actually been around for a long time in Babylon and various folks, but Darwin made it popular in modern times, and actually he got some funding to put his book out, which is an interesting topic all in itself. But Darwin was 22 and he was fresh out of school to be a preacher, and he decided instead to go off and sail on the HMS Beagle in 1831. Now, we know a bit about what he did on that trip because he had a diary. So when he went on this voyage, he took 2 books with him. He took the Bible, and he took Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology. He said this book changed his life forever. Because in Charles Lyell's book, he talks about gradual, slow processes like rain and wind causing the geology over long periods of time. So that really affected him. Now, he had a problem with religion, and he talked about it in his diary. He didn't really understand how good things can happen to bad people and bad things can happen to good people. Well, he probably didn't read Psalm 92:7, which said, "When the wicked spring up like grass, and when the workers of iniquity flourish, it is that they may be destroyed forever." God's got a plan to deal with it. It's funny, he could look over long periods of time in the past, but he couldn't look at any time very far in the future. Now, Darwin did have some significant contributions to science. Honey, could you give me a napkin? He categorized minor variations. That's good science. He defined some methods for variation, like isolated populations, like on the island of Galapagos. The isolation had some differences. And that's good science. But he had a big issue. He speculated wildly on big changes from many small changes over a large period of time. You see, there's something under here for me. Excuse me. It's probably because I'm nervous. So we're going to go look at his book because we're going to study his book a little bit. And in his book, well, he has a title to his book that most people don't know. You know, they know The Origin of Species, but they usually don't know the full name of the book because it's politically incorrect. And they wouldn't want to advertise the real title these days, because the title of his book is The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Now, Darwin thought that Aborigines and people from Africa were a different race, but we're actually one race. There's the human race, and that's all descended from Adam. But Darwin wanted to talk about different races, and actually this has been used to justify the final solution for Jews, ethnic cleansing for the Tutsi, and really eugenics for all of us. Now we hear about Darwin in our textbooks. Here's an example in the World of Biology by Davis. It says, Darwin speculated, well, they left a word out of there. It should say wildly, that all forms of life are related through descent with modification from earliest organisms. This speculation has been verified. I said, what? When did they do that? I didn't see that headline. They're telling our children it's been verified. Well, that's actually a blatant lie. It's not true. It's not been verified ever. You know, Darwin never would have come up with his theory if he had modern microscopes. He thought that cells were this sort of amorphous little simple thing. But if you look fairly closely at a cell, you see cells are far from simple. Now, this is a paramecium, a single-celled organism, and it does all the functions of a body. It takes things in, it guards the outside so not let bad chemicals in. It has waste removal. It has reproduction. It's been compared to the complexity of the space shuttle. There's nothing simple about a single-celled organism. And our chromosomes, which are so intrinsic in our makeup, are very complex. Now, it's actually misleading to see a picture like this of chromosomes, because you think of this short thing with just a few molecules wrapped around. Oh, no. If I took, for instance, a human has 50 trillion cells. And the DNA from all of our body, if you were to put it in in 2 teaspoons, it would just fill 2 tablespoons. If you stretched it end to end, you could go to the moon and back 5 million times. Now, just recently, they were actually able to photograph this DNA, and you could see it's a long thing. And they have to really even zoom in on this to see the individual turns. This is a very, very complex molecule. It's the most complex molecule in the world, in the universe. If you took the information out of one person's DNA, out of all their body, and wrote it on books, it would fill the Grand Canyon 40 times. The amount of information kept in our body is astounding. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. David had it he understood. Now, I have to tell you, DNA, very little is actually known about DNA. They talk about, we've mapped DNA. Well, it's a little bit like saying, we took a picture of him from a mile off. We understand him completely. It's mind-numbingly complicated. It's like a huge computer program, self-replicating. I mean, our technology is so far behind what the DNA molecules do. It'll be, and we're cutting and sticking them together and just saying, what happens? Whoa. And of course, being so complex, the odds of DNA forming by chance is astronomically against it. Now, I've heard someone say that there are certain chemicals that have to be used in this, and there's right-handed and left-handed, and they need all right-handed. Well, that makes it even more difficult, because how do you get all those kind together? It's just astounding, really. Well, the chromosome number, if you were to believe in evolution, you would think that the simpler creatures would have fewer chromosomes and the more complex creatures would have more. And actually, this whole idea of complexity and simplicity is made up. But let's look at a chart of chromosomes. Here we have a chromosome chart, and we look at, see here, humans and chimpanzees. We think of ourselves as so great. Maybe the chimpanzees are faking it. And the ultimate of evolution is the amoeba. You see the problem? Now, Susan helped me out. There was the problem here over this wheat that, the chromosomes of wheat have actually gotten kind of doubled and doubled a few times. It's actually making wheat a problem to eat. And I think that's why a lot of people are gluten intolerant, like me. So, I went through the book, Origin of Species, with blah, 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 and I picked out the main concepts, the pillars of the theory. So this is the theory, these pillars of his theory. This is what it stands on. So I'm going to look at each of these pillars, and we'll decide whether or not evolution is a valid theory. If it has any these pillars stand. Well, we'll start with the first one, natural selection. Now here we have a textbook. It says Evolution and Natural Selection, How Natural Selection Causes Evolution. Okay. So that's what they think. But now, first of all, I have to say, creationists really have no problem with natural selection. As a matter of fact, we thought of it first. Edward Blyth did 24 years before Darwin. And actually, natural selection is only a conservation or conservative process. That means like a quality control that removes defective organisms and keeps the species strong. I like to give the example of a bicycle factory. So we're going to stick our quality control person, the natural selection, at the end of the bicycle factory. And if a bicycle comes out and it doesn't work, we don't let it go. We take it back. Okay? So how long do we have to do that before we have a motorcycle? You see, it doesn't add anything. Natural selection can only act on those biologic properties that already exist. It cannot create properties in order to meet adaptional needs. It's one statement they use. They say, survival of the fittest. Well, that's interesting. See, survival of the fittest does not explain arrival of the fittest. And actually, that's a tautology. You know, why did they survive? They were the fittest. They were the fittest because they survived. They survived because anyway, that's going nowhere fast, right? It's sort of defining the survivor as being the fittest, which means it's like saying the survival of the survivals. Survival of the survivors. It's actually usually the survival of the luckiest. But there's no evolution in natural selection. So let's look at the second pillar. I remember saying this phrase when I was in grade school. Ontology recapitulates phylogeny. How many had to say that? Yeah, okay, y'all got taught this. So anyway, what this really means is developmental stages, ontogeny, recapitulates as relives ancestry or phylogeny. So the idea is in the egg or in the womb, you relive all the stages of evolution that you went through. So you started off as a simple cell, then you became a fish, and all you relive those things as an embryo and all. Well, Ernst Haeckel, he read Darwin's book about this. He said it was the turning point in his thinking. Well, and he came up with these drawings in 1874. Now, they call it Haeckel's fake drawings because, well, they were a 19th century drawings are still appear in reference books, are badly misdrawn, says an embryologist in Britain. Although Haeckel confessed to drawing from memory and was convicted of fraud at the University of Jena, the drawings persist. That's the real mystery. So these fraudulent drawings are in modern textbooks. Here's an example, Evolutionary Analysis, 1999, University of West Florida. They're using these fake drawings 100 years after he was convicted of fraud. And what they do is they have this situation where they say, oh, well, you know, we got these ripples in the neck when we're an embryo, and those are gill slits. But if you see what happens, like these colors, 1, 2, 3, 4, when you grow older, they don't have anything to do with breathing. So if they were gill slits, you would expect them to move into the lungs or be part of the esophagus or something having to do with breathing, and they have nothing to do with it. So that idea is wrong. And here we have a book from 1993. Here we have mentioning gill slits like a fish. That's a lie, but it's in the textbook. That's a science textbook with a lie in it. Here's another textbook, gill slits, and they give us a tail, because we used to be a fish, huh? Well, what we have is lies, but we have no evolution here. There's no method for evolution. There's no verification of evolution. There's no evolution. Okay, so we got through 2. Let's do number 3, genetic memory. Now, genetic memory is, let's say, for instance, I ran barefoot a lot, and I got heavy calluses on my feet, and then I have a baby, me and my wife. And the baby would have stronger feet because of my life experience. That's what genetic memory would be. Well, they did a mouse tail experiment to try to check this out. And what they did is they measured the length of the tail of the mice. And then they decided for a number of generations they would chop the tail off as soon as they were born. So they kept chopping their tails off. And then they measured, after a number of generations, what's the length of the mouse tail? And it was the same. Well, modern geneticists understand chopping the tail off has nothing to do with the genetics of the creature, and no one believes in genetic memory the way Darwin did. So there's no evolution here. The next one is spontaneous creation. Now, if Darwin had read all the way to the 2nd chapter of the Bible, he would have learned on the 7th day God ended his work which he had made. See, this really comes from when people used to toss their garbage outside the city. They found that rats spontaneously, out of nowhere, were created around garbage. And that meat that was rotten and thrown out, that spontaneously maggots would form on them. Well, they had a famous experiment called the bell jar experiment, where they put some meat in a jar. It was unsealed. Then they put some meat on a jar with some gauze over it. And then they put some meat in a jar with a cork in it. Well, the flies came in and laid their eggs on the meat, and then, voila, we have maggots. Then they laid it on the gauze, and we had the maggots on the gauze. I guess they could smell the meat in the jar. And then when we have the cork on it, there were no maggots. Well, it became obvious that the flies were laying the maggot eggs, and that's where the maggots came from. So, spontaneous creation's out. We have no evolution here. Gee, we're running out of pillars here. Let's see. This is the last one. Here we go. This is it. If we don't find evolution here. Well, mutations are genetic in nature. And we have some understanding of genetics. We do breeding to try to do that. And I look, this ancient ancestral dog, and they have this chart that shows you all the dog breeds that have come from this ancestral dog, and there's no Chihuahuas anywhere on this list. I don't know what's up with that. But what we find, and breeders know this very well, that when you start breeding an animal like this, that you actually limit variation. You have high-strung dogs who have been bred too much. You can breed a Chihuahua so you can get like a totally useless dog. Anyway, there's Chica's got her face down there, going to attack that Great Dane. But you couldn't take a Chihuahua and then rebreed it back into a large dog. Information is lost. They're swimming at the shallow end of the gene pool. Like, for instance, if genetics is a little bit like letters. So if you take the word Christmas, You can get hazmat, Sam, Christ, ram, sat, hit, etc. But you cannot get Xerox or zebra or a holy day. Just can't get it. Now here's a five-legged bull. He's got a leg up there on the shoulder. It doesn't run any faster. And you notice it's not a wing or a fin. It's a leg. You know, he already had that genetic information. Here's a mutant Ancon sheep. And it's got short legs. I don't think it would last too long in nature. Couldn't run so good. Here we have a mutant turtle, although he's not ninja. Now, we've done a massive number of experiments on fruit flies. We subject them, I believe it was to x-rays, I'm not positive, but I think it was x-rays they would do that. And in many schools, high schools and whatnot, would do these experiments on fruit flies. Now, I thought about that. I thought, if they really believed in evolution and that mutations was going to help spur it on, wouldn't this be the most dangerous experiment to ever do? We were going to make like the super fruit fly, right? Well, when they did they subjected the eggs to this X-rays. They got curly wings, white eyes. Many of the eggs never hatched. It was lethal. They had yellow bodies, stubby wings. And this wingless one, I don't know, you have fruit flies, so I guess it'd be like a fruit crawl. So you have observations and conclusions, right? You do an experiment, you have observations and conclusions. So let's look at the observations. They observed, all mutations observed, produced flies that were inferior to the original fly. Okay, that was what they observed. That's science, right? Observed. What was their conclusion? Fruit flies must have evolved as far as they can go. Well, here's a evolutionist statement. It says, mutations do not produce any kind of evolution. And we can go to the textbook and it says, think critically. Do you think humans are still evolving? It's like, are you still beating your wife? You know, the people that are asking us to think critically, maybe they ought to think critically. These leading questions. Oh. Well, here's the proper conclusions after looking at what mutations do to creatures. First, they limit variations. You know, you have loss of information. Most are harmful, if not deadly. There's things like hemophilia. It's quite harmful. Well, this is all the pillars, and there's no evolution here. Myth busted. Now, Michael Behe. Whoa. What happened there? Uh-oh, back up. It just like jumped like a bunch. Okay, here we go. Michael Behe. Now, Michael Behe wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box. And in this book, he talked about irreducibly complex systems. So I like to use a rat trap as an example. The idea is there's only a few parts on this. There's the trigger mechanism, there's the spring, there's the hammer, and there's the platform to hold it all together. And if any of these parts are missing, you have to have all the parts before it's an operational, functional unit. So it's irreducibly complex. Now, I asked somebody, what could I take out? And he says, well, you could take the paint off. Well, you could do that, but the rest of it is required for the system to work. Now, evolution requires single changes, little changes, and each change has to be an improvement that allows them to survive more. And a mouse trap could never evolve. And we have all kinds of systems in our body that are irreducibly complex. So it's a big argument against evolution. To suppose that the eye, an irreducibly complex system, could have been formed by natural selections, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. This is Charles Darwin said this. Because the eye is really, and he didn't even know how complex it was in his time. See, the retina of your eye is less than 1 square inch and contains over 37 million light-sensitive cells. You think about a camera, you get a 36 megapixel camera, it costs $5,000. I haven't heard of any 137 megapixel cameras or stereoscopic. Your eyes are worth a lot, and they're complex, and we haven't gotten to that level of complexity. But a theory, it must predict something. Can you think of anything the theory of evolution has predicted or helped society or done anything of any value? I challenge you to tell me, what good is the theory? What has it helped us? It must be falsifiable. I don't know. I've done my best to falsify it in about every 2 or 3 slides. And yet the theory is still around. So we have these that stand on, but we've shown that these don't work. So what is the theory of evolution today? What do they use for Darwinism or evolutionary science now if this doesn't work? Well, they have a thing called Neo Darwinism. Actually, Neo Darwinism is just mutations create the change, and natural selection decides it's any good of a change. Well, we showed that natural selection and mutation don't work. Well, that's why Michael Denton wrote the book, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. The theory has had so many detractors, so many problems with the theory, that the theory is in crisis. And you know, when they get in crisis, instead of throwing the theory away, they come up with more and more preposterous ideas. So here comes one. It's called punctuated equilibrium. They love big words. Anyway, basically what it means is we have a whole bunch of mutations at once so that we can get these irreducibly complex systems handled. So that, like, for instance, a reptile could have a bird. Wow. I don't know, I just thought, well, all right, what's it going to eat? How is it going to recognize the mate? And how are they going to avoid mama? Now, Charles Darwin put a test for his theory. So he was trying to be a little bit of a scientist here. He says, if my theory be true, that means if it isn't, then this is how we can prove it, right? If my theory be true, numberless intermediate varieties, that's a whole bunch, must assuredly have existed. That's the missing link thing, you know? See, actually, in his time, he thought that there would be a whole rainbow of species that would link from one to the next in a rainbow, gradual, and they'd all be alive at once. So you see, each step was successful. So why is it gone now? So he expected them all to be alive at once, and he didn't find them. So he thought, well, maybe they were in the past. Well, here's somebody who wrote, Dr. Colin Paterson, a senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History, and asked him about these intermediate species in this guy's book. And he says, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. I lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil. What? Not the depth of this statement. He's not saying there's no precursor for humans. He's saying there's no precursor for anything. Any fossil of any kind. All the species are nice and distinct always and always have been. Wow, that's a problem. Stephen Gould, he is a famous evolutionary scientist. The absence of fossil evidence for intermediary stages has been a persistent and nagging problem for evolution. Well, let's look a little bit at just humans for a minute. Now, if you ever say to an evolutionist, I think you think humans evolved from chimpanzees or apes, and he goes, "Oh no, I don't. That apes and chimpanzees, they evolved from the same thing that humans did." All right. Well, how come in your textbooks you put in a chimpanzee when you're talking about human evolution? Were you our ancestors, Daddy? Well, I'm going to give you the bottom line on how this whole fossil record thing for humans goes. First of all, what they do is some fossils are selectively excluded. They take evidence and they say, well, this doesn't prove evolution. Let's get rid of that. It's an outlier. They got words for saying we don't want to pay attention to evidence. And then some human fossils, they arbitrarily downgrade, meaning they talk about it and they say, well, it's the skull is a little small and the jawbone is less formed. I don't know. You could take this room right here and you could line everybody up by skull size. And you know what it would mean? Nothing. Well, if they find skulls around and they find a big one and a small one, they say, well, let's throw the big one out. Okay, the small one looks good. So, they downgrade them, they talk them down. Then they find non-human fossils and they talk them up. And what that effectively does is takes the gap between the species and makes it look smaller. It's a trick. And some of the fossils are downright frauds. Now, they didn't read the Torah, I guess. It says, thou shalt not bear false witness against your neighbor. And I can't think of a worse use of testimony than to testify that we came from apes instead of from God. And that's against our neighbor. Darwin thought that the natives were a different race. That's where that idea of we have races. We don't have races, we have a race. That they were advanced animals. For instance, Aborigines down in Australia. They didn't think they were as evolved as us white people because they had a bigger jaw. Except the Aborigines, they used their teeth for just about everything, and if you did what they did, you'd have a big jaw too. The National Museum of Natural History in the Smithsonian has 33,000 skulls they've gathered to try to prove the different size skulls and evolution and all that. I'm just thinking they need to go out and bury those people. Germany was embarrassed because they had to return some skulls to Namibia because they had taken them saying these skulls were evidence of lack of evolutionary progress. It's been used for race prejudice so much. In 1904, the World's Fair in St. Louis, Missouri, had a pygmy inside of a small zoo-like setup to show his lack of evolutionary progress, and his name was Otabenga. Well, he wrote this book about his experiences in the St. Louis Fair, Here's an article that says that humans are becoming less intelligent. Many humans may gradually lose intelligence, according to a new study. The study, published in 2012 in the Journal of Trends in Genetics, argues that humans lost the evolutionary pressures. And talks about how we emerged from Africa. I guess, we were working our way up to reading and all that. Now we've kind of decayed down to Twitter. 140 characters is enough, huh? Well, stunting is not just about height. With malnutrition, with malnourishment, there comes greater susceptibility to disease and impaired cognitive function, even lower IQ. Stunted kids are more likely to drop out of school, to grow up unskilled workers with little potential for economic success later in life. The main cause of stunted growth is a lack of vital nutrients. Here's a picture of two sets of children. One set of children was given extra nutritional supplements, and the other was not. They grew more, they were more intelligent, their genetics was more pure, they had less disease, and they had a longer life expectancy. Interestingly enough, if you were to feed the other children, now they may have already been damaged by this age, but if you feed other children, their children, the DNA actually gets repaired. And they grow taller, and they're more intelligent, and have less disease and all that. What amazing creatures we are. Well, let's look. This shows us signs of de-evolution. No, it's just malnutrition. Let's look at the ascent of man. Now, they'll show you a picture like this, as though there's this nice, clean, there's like this, a nice rainbow of fossils that they found between apes and man. Now, I don't know where the line is, but there's a line somewhere you could draw. And everything to the right of the line would all be true humans, and everything to the left of the line would be true apes and chimpanzees and whatnot. It's an artificial diagram based on their ideas of evolution. We also have evolution's Hall of Shame. Nebraska Man, probably you've heard of Nebraska Man. It was scientifically built from one tooth. Now, the artist drew what the man looked like from his tooth. That's a pretty good trick. But even better, they drew his wife from one tooth. Yeah. So this was published in 1922. You want to see the real Nebraska Man? Well, a little bit later, they were digging in the area and they found more complete skeletons, and they found out it was a pig. Now, this evidence was used in the famous Scopes monkey trial as proof of evolution. Then we had Piltdown Man. Now, Piltdown Man was found in Piltdown, England, and it was basically the skull of a human with an orangutan's jaw glued to it. And it was brought forward in 1913, and it took them 40 years to figure out it was a fraud. Now, there were 250 doctoral theses that were written on these bones. I have to ask the question, did they revoke these doctorates when they discovered the bones were frauds? Did they revoke the doctorates of those who got doctorates from those doctors after the fraud? Of course not. So what is that doctorate worth? Now, Neanderthal Man, that's talked a lot about. The guy who discovered Neanderthal Man announced he was going to go discover Neanderthal Man in Java when he went on a trip there. And what he found was these bones, a skull cap and one piece of bone, like a femur or something like that. Now, really, it's just a large ape. And if they'd found more of the skull, they would have known that. And it was found in the same layer with true humans. Now, the finder of this said he hid the true human bones because it would detract from his find. Well, it would prove that we didn't descend from him. And what happened was somebody else found some true human bones in the same layer, and he says, oh, yeah, I found those. What? So, I don't know, Java Man doesn't work. Now, they also had some that they found some bones, and it looked like it was bent over. And the guy had rickets. He wasn't, coming up he was going down because he had rickets. And there's Peking Man. Oh, it's nicely between the human skull and the ape skull. It was found in the 1920s or 30s, but sometime during World War II, the skull disappeared. We had some moldings taken from the skull, but we don't have the actual skull, so it's hard to tell what it is. But 2 scientists did inspect it, and they just thought it was a heavy-duty ape. So, now it's funny. I don't know if you saw on television in 2000 when they had this millennium thing going on in China. They had this TV show, and they had 2 young, athletic Chinese people running up some stairs with torches, and they come up to this big statue, and it was the head of an ape. I thought, this is ancestor worship? What is this? It's like they're worshiping evolution. I'm going to skip over Lucy, save a little time since I'm about out. Here's some footprints in what's supposed to be 3.75 million years ago from hominids. And listen to the discussion that, look at the feet. They try to twist the feet to stick them out, to make them look like their feet are sticking way out, but the footprints don't have that in there at all. But anyway, the footprints describe are remarkably similar to those of modern man. The form of the foot was exactly the same as ours. Weight-bearing pressure patterns in the prints resembled humans. Footprints so very much like it's ours. Now, if they've never found Homo erectus foot bones, the problem is that they find them, they find out they're not what they think they are. And you can find out about these bones in a book called Bones of Contention. So where does the Stone Age come in? We have all this Stone Age findings. Well, it's kind of Gilligan's Island after the Ark. And since I ran out of time, I'm going to try to move forward. We have vestigial organs, and actually, and vestigial organs are supposed to be organs left over from previous evolutionary processes. That's kind of opposite of evolution if you're losing stuff, isn't it? And we find out that maybe they should correct the textbooks when they find out these things aren't really vestigial, that, the appendix is actually used to store good bacteria. So if you have a bad bout of diarrhea, you have something to replenish the bacteria to keep you alive. Don't get it cut out. Anyway, next session we're going to look at astronomy. In a session called Dust Everywhere, we're going to look at the moon landing, comets, some physics problems, and some somewhat new information. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time to look at your great creation and to show that you did create all this stuff, that you are the only one that could have. The complexity of DNA, we're just astounded and in awe of what you've done. We thank you in Yeshua's name. Amen.